The chamber doors sealed shut with a heavy metallic sound just as King Solmara IX raised his hand for silence, and I felt every one of the 11 hearts in my body quicken at once. I am Threnkai Voss, Senior Ambassador of the Verite Compact, and I had waited 3 long years to hear the words the king was about to speak. Around me, 1,000 delegates from every corner of the coalition leaned forward in their seats. The air itself seemed to hum with anticipation. "Esteemed members of this Senate," the king began, his voice carried across the chamber by 100 hidden speakers, "today marks the end of an age of fear." A murmur rolled through the crowd like a wave across still water. I gripped the edges of my seat, my clawed fingers pressing into the smooth metal. After 3 years of silence from their border, after 3 years of scanning every dead colony and every abandoned outpost, our fleet analysts have confirmed what many of us have hoped for since the war ended. The king paused, letting the silence stretch long enough to hurt. The species known as Homo sapiens, the humans, no longer exist. The chamber exploded into sound. Delegates from 100 worlds rose from their seats, some cheering, some weeping with relief, some simply staring in disbelief at the golden light show that began to fill the ceiling above us in celebration. I did not rise. I sat very still, watching the king's face, watching for any flicker of doubt behind his practiced smile. I found none. He believed it completely. I will admit, to my shame now, that in that moment I felt something close to joy myself. I had lost family in the war. Every delegate in that room had lost someone or knew someone who had. The humans had fought like no other species the coalition had ever faced. They had turned dying moons into weapons. They had sent ships without fuel to return, crewed by volunteers who knew they would never see their homes again. They had done things in that war that even now I struggle to describe without my hands shaking. So when the king declared them gone, extinguished, wiped from the pages of the galaxy forever, the relief in that chamber was almost a physical thing. I could taste it in the recycled air. Champagne glasses appeared as if summoned by magic, passed hand to hand along the rows. An old Kethrian general 2 seats down from me began to laugh, a great booming sound, and clapped his neighbor on the back hard enough to nearly knock her from her chair. "Voss," he called to me, raising his glass, "did you ever think we would live to see this day?" I raised my own glass out of politeness, though I did not drink from it. "I did not think the day would come so quietly," I said. He did not seem to hear the caution in my words. Few people did, that day. The king continued speaking, describing in careful, measured tones the final months of the human collapse. He spoke of their homeworld, sealed off and silent. He spoke of their colony ships, found drifting and empty, their reactors cold. He spoke of a final battle, fought at the edge of what had once been human territory, where the last organized resistance had supposedly been crushed by a joint fleet under coalition command. I listened carefully to every word, and even then, something in the story felt too smooth, too complete, like a wound stitched closed before anyone had checked what was still bleeding beneath the surface. "Let this day be remembered," the king said, his arms spread wide now, embracing the cheering crowd, "as the day the galaxy became safe again. Let every child born from this moment forward grow up never knowing the fear their parents knew. The age of humanity is over." The applause that followed was thunderous. I clapped along with the rest, because that is what an ambassador does, even when his mind is somewhere else entirely. I looked around the chamber, at the joy on so many faces, the tears, the embraces between old soldiers who had fought side by side against an enemy none of them had ever truly understood. And yet, I could not stop myself from glancing toward the small section of seats reserved for military liaisons, the officers who had actually served on the front lines during the worst years of the conflict. Most of them were smiling, some even cheering. But a few sat very still, their eyes fixed not on the king, but on the great doors at the rear of the chamber, as though they expected those doors to open at any moment. One of them, an old human war veteran named Colonel Priya Malhotra, was not smiling at all. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her jaw set, watching the celebration around her with an expression I could only describe as dread. I had spoken with her once before, at a diplomatic function years earlier, and I remembered her as calm and quick to laugh. She was not laughing now. I made a note to speak with her later, though at the time I told myself it was simple curiosity, nothing more. The king finished his address with a final toast to peace, and the Senate broke into a celebration that would last long into the night, across 100 worlds. Bells rang in cities I would never visit, fireworks lit skies I had only seen in pictures. For one single day, the galaxy allowed itself to believe that the worst was finally behind it. I left the chamber that evening through a side corridor, intending to find a quiet place to think. The halls of the Senate building were usually calm after a session, populated only by cleaning staff and the occasional aide rushing between offices. That night, they were filled with laughter and singing, delegates from a dozen species embracing each other in the corridors, some already well into their celebrations. I passed a group of young pages, barely more than children in their respective species terms, dancing in a circle near a fountain that had been built to commemorate the war's end years before, back when everyone still believed the humans might return one day to finish what they started. Looking at it now, in the golden light of that celebration, it seemed almost like a monument to something that had never truly ended at all, only paused. I did not know it then, standing in that corridor with the sound of victory ringing in my ears, but I was one of the very few people in that entire building who would remember, months later, that the celebration had begun with a lie so large that none of us had thought to question it. We had been told a war was over. What none of us understood yet was that the only side that had ever stopped fighting was the one who had already won. I made my way to the observation deck at the top of the Senate Tower, a quiet place I often visited when I needed to think away from the noise of politics. The tower overlooked the capital city, its spires and gardens lit up now in celebration, fireworks bursting silently against the dark sky far below. I stood at the railing for a long while, watching the light show, listening to the distant sound of cheering carried up on the wind. Colonel Malhotra found me there perhaps an hour later. I heard her boots on the metal walkway before I saw her, a slow, measured pace that told me she was not in any hurry to speak. "You didn't drink," she said, coming to stand beside me at the railing. "Neither did you, from what I saw." She was quiet for a moment, watching the fireworks. "Do you know what the hardest part of that war was, Ambassador?" "I imagine there were many hard parts." "The hardest part," she said, ignoring my attempt at humor, "was that we never once beat them in a fair fight. Every battle we won because they let us win it. Every retreat we forced, they had already planned before we fired the first shot." She turned to look at me, and in the reflected light of the fireworks, I saw something in her eyes I had not expected. It was not sorrow, it was fear. "They surrendered," I said slowly. "Their homeworld went silent. Their fleets stopped responding." "Yes," she said. "And doesn't that strike you as strange, Ambassador? An enemy who fights with everything they have for a decade, who never once asks for peace, who takes losses that would break any other species within a year, and then simply stops, all at once, everywhere, no negotiation, no surrender broadcast, no final message, just silence." I had no answer for her. I had wondered the same thing myself, in quieter moments, but I had always pushed the thought aside, told myself that grief and exhaustion could end a war just as easily as victory could. "I was there at the end," she continued, her voice dropping lower. "At what they're calling the final battle. I commanded a support wing, and I will tell you something the official reports will never say, because I signed the paperwork that helped bury it." She paused, glancing around the empty observation deck as though checking for anyone listening. "We didn't destroy their fleet. Their fleet left, in perfect formation, no panic, no distress calls, no attempt to save the wounded ships that were falling behind, because there were no wounded ships falling behind. Every single vessel that left that battle left under its own power, in good order, like a parade rather than a retreat. Below us, another burst of fireworks lit the sky in brilliant gold, and somewhere in the city, a great cheer rose up in response. "Where did they go?" I asked quietly. Colonel Malhotra looked at me for a long moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper, as though even now, years later, she was afraid of being overheard. "That," she said, "is the question nobody in that chamber tonight has bothered to ask. And I am beginning to think that is going to be a very serious mistake." I stood there on that tower long after she had gone, watching the fireworks fade one by one across the sleeping city, and for the first time since the king's announcement, the warm relief I had felt in the chamber began to curdle into something colder. I told myself it was simply the cynicism of an old diplomat who had seen too many wars end badly before. I told myself that Colonel Malhotra was simply a soldier who had not yet learned how to feel peace again after so many years of feeling only its opposite. I did not yet understand that she was the only person in that entire tower who was actually paying attention. It was nearly 4 months before the first crack appeared in the story we had all been so eager to believe, and when it did, it arrived not with an announcement or a report delivered to the Senate floor, but with something far quieter and far more unsettling: silence, where there should have been sound. I was in my office reviewing trade agreements when my aide, a sharp young Osirian named Phaela, knocked on my door with a look on her face that told me something was wrong before she said a single word. "Ambassador," she said, "you should see this." She placed a data slate on my desk, showing a communications log from a relay station near what had once been the human border, a quiet sector nobody paid much attention to anymore since the humans had supposedly vanished from it entirely. The station reported a routine malfunction, nothing more than a maintenance note buried in 1,000 identical reports that crossed my desk every week. Ordinarily, I would not have looked twice at it. "Why does this concern me?" I asked. "Because it's the 4th one this month," Phaela said. 4 relay stations along that border have gone dark, all reporting the same kind of malfunction, all within a single sector that hasn't had any recorded activity in 3 years. I felt a small chill settle over me, though I could not yet say why. "Coincidences happen, Phaela." 4 times, in the same sector, in the same month, after 3 years of nothing? She shook her head. "I don't like coincidences that convenient, Ambassador." Neither did I, if I was being honest with myself. I thought of Colonel Malhotra on the observation deck, her quiet certainty that something about the human ending did not add up. I had not spoken to her since that night, though I had thought of her often, especially in quiet moments when the celebrations of that first day began to feel less like relief and more like something people had convinced themselves to feel, because the alternative was too frightening to consider. I requested a formal briefing on the relay stations through the proper channels, expecting the usual bureaucratic delay before someone eventually got back to me with an explanation involving aging equipment and cosmic radiation. Instead, I received a response within hours, which itself was unusual enough to notice, informing me that the matter had already been reviewed and resolved at a level above my clearance, and that no further inquiry was necessary. I sat with that message for a long time after it arrived, reading it over and over, looking for something I might have missed. There was nothing hidden in the words themselves. It was the speed of the reply and the flatness of its refusal that told me everything I needed to know. Someone did not want questions asked about that sector, and in my long career as a diplomat, I had learned that the questions people did not want asked were almost always the most important ones. I began, quietly and carefully, to ask them anyway. Over the following weeks, I gathered small pieces of information the way one gathers stones from a riverbed, each one unremarkable on its own, but together forming a shape I did not like. A coalition scout ship, the Meridian's Hope, had returned from a routine patrol near the old human border 2 months earlier, its crew debriefed and quietly reassigned to posts scattered across the galaxy, none of them speaking to each other or to anyone else about what they had encountered out there. I managed, through an old contact in the Fleet Registry Office, to learn the name of the ship's captain, a steady, unremarkable officer named Daniel Ashworth, who had served without incident for nearly 20 years. I requested a meeting with him through official channels, and was told, politely but firmly, that Captain Ashworth was currently on medical leave and unavailable for the foreseeable future. When I pressed further, the response grew colder, until eventually I received a message suggesting that continued inquiries into fleet personnel matters outside my diplomatic purview would not be looked upon favorably by certain offices within the Senate. I stopped asking about Captain Ashworth after that, at least through official channels. But I did not stop thinking about him. Around the same time, I began to notice a pattern in the sensor logs that were routinely shared with the diplomatic corps as part of standard transparency protocols, a practice put in place after the war to reassure member worlds that no threats were being hidden from them. Certain sectors near the old human border simply stopped appearing in these logs, not marked as classified, not flagged as restricted, simply absent, as though they had quietly been removed from the reports before anyone thought to ask why. I brought my concerns to a small committee meeting one afternoon, a gathering of perhaps a dozen delegates who oversaw matters of border security and fleet oversight. I laid out what I had found as carefully and factually as I could, avoiding speculation, presenting only the gaps and the silences I had documented. The response was not what I expected. Several of the older delegates in the room, veterans of the war themselves, grew visibly uncomfortable as I spoke. One of them, a heavy-set Kethrian trade minister who had lost 2 sons in the fighting, would not meet my eyes at all. Another, a younger delegate who had joined the Senate after the war ended, dismissed my concerns almost immediately. "Ambassador Voss," she said, not unkindly, "I understand that a diplomat's mind is trained to see conspiracy in every shadow. But sometimes a malfunctioning relay station is simply a malfunctioning relay station. The humans are gone. We have confirmed this at the highest levels. I would encourage you to let the dead rest in peace, rather than disturbing their memory with theories that serve no one." There was a murmur of agreement around the table, though I noticed that not everyone joined in. The Kethrian minister who would not meet my eyes said nothing at all, and when the meeting ended, he lingered behind as the others filed out, waiting until we were alone before he finally spoke. "You should stop asking these questions, Ambassador," he said quietly, "not because you are wrong, because you are right, and there are people in this building who would rather you were not." I asked him what he meant, but he only shook his head and walked away, leaving me alone in that empty committee room with my data slate, full of small, unremarkable silences that were beginning to feel less like coincidence and more like the outline of something enormous being carefully hidden from view. That night I could not sleep. I sat by the window of my quarters, looking out over the same city that had celebrated so joyfully months before, its lights now calm and ordinary beneath a clear sky, and I thought about Colonel Malhotra's words on the observation deck. An enemy who fights with everything they have, and then simply stops. All at once, everywhere. No negotiation, no surrender broadcast, no final message. I thought about a fleet that left a battle in perfect formation, like a parade rather than a retreat. I thought about relay stations going dark in a sector where nothing was supposed to be happening at all, and a scout ship's crew who would not speak to anyone about what they had seen out there, and a captain suddenly unavailable for the foreseeable future, and sensor logs quietly emptied of an entire border region as though someone had reached in and erased it with careful, patient hands. I did not yet know what any of it meant, but I understood, with a growing certainty that settled into my bones like cold water, that whatever had truly happened to the humans, it was not the story we had all celebrated in that chamber 4 months earlier. Something had been buried, and I had the terrible feeling that whatever it was not going to stay buried for very much longer. I was right, though I could not have imagined, on that quiet, sleepless night, just how soon the ground was about to break open, or what would come walking calmly through the cracks. The alarm did not sound the way alarms are supposed to sound. There was no wailing siren, no flashing red light sweeping across the chamber walls. There was only a strange, sudden quiet, as though every automated system in the building had drawn in a breath at the exact same moment, and then a single soft chime that most delegates barely noticed over the murmur of the morning session. I noticed it. I had spent 4 months learning to notice things other people overlooked, and that small, polite chime sent a jolt of cold awareness straight through my chest. I was seated near the rear of the Senate chamber that day, listening to a tedious debate over trade tariffs between 2 mining consortiums, when the main doors at the far end of the hall, doors built from reinforced alloy thick enough to withstand a small orbital strike, simply opened. There was no explosion, no breach alarm, no security team rushing in with weapons drawn. The doors opened the way a door opens when someone on the other side has simply decided to walk through it, calm and unhurried, as though the 2 tons of armored metal weighed nothing at all. I turned in my seat along with perhaps 100 other delegates, most of us assuming some dignitary had arrived late for the session, and the doors had simply been opened for them by an usher we could not see. That assumption lasted only until the figure stepped through the entrance, and the entire chamber, 1,000 voices strong, fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. She was human. That much was obvious immediately, and it alone was enough to send a ripple of confusion through the room, because there were no living humans left anywhere in the coalition, not according to every official record, every solemn announcement, every celebration that had rung out across 100 worlds 4 months earlier. And yet here one stood, in the flesh, walking through the Senate's most secure entrance as though she owned the building. She was old. Her hair, what I could see of it beneath a simple gray hood, was the color of ash, and deep lines marked a face that had clearly seen more years and more hardship than most humans I had encountered during the war. She wore a long coat, dark and unremarkable, the kind of garment that might have been fashionable decades earlier, or might never have been fashionable at all. She carried nothing in her hands. She wore no obvious weapon. She walked with the unhurried, measured gait of someone who has nowhere urgent to be, because everywhere she goes, the world simply waits for her to arrive. For a long moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Even King Solmara, seated on the raised dais at the front of the chamber, seemed frozen, his mouth slightly open around whatever sentence he had been speaking when the doors opened behind him. It was a young security officer near the entrance who broke the silence first, and I will never forget the sound of his voice, thin and cracking with a fear I had never heard from a trained officer before. He said a single word, quiet at first, then louder as the shock of recognition seemed to hit him all at once. Baba Yaga. The name meant nothing to me in that instant, though I could see immediately, from the reaction it produced around the chamber, that it meant a great deal to many of the delegates present. Colonel Malhotra, whom I spotted near the military liaison section, went pale as parchment. Several of the older Kethrian veterans near the front rows actually rose from their seats, not in aggression, but in something closer to instinctive retreat, as though their bodies remembered a danger their minds had tried very hard to forget. I turned to the delegate beside me, a normally composed Thessarian trade officer named Callum Voss, and asked quietly what the name meant. His hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of his seat. "It's a story," he whispered. "A ghost story the human soldiers used to tell during the war. Not about a person, about a thing that comes for you when you think you're finally safe." "A ghost story doesn't have a body," I said, watching the woman continue her slow, unhurried walk down the central aisle of the chamber. "That is not a ghost." Callum said nothing further. He simply watched, the way every other delegate in that room was now watching, as the woman reached the halfway point of the aisle and, for the first time since entering, came to a complete stop. She looked around the chamber slowly, taking in the vast assembly of alien faces staring back at her, in a silence so profound it felt almost sacred, or perhaps profane, I could not decide which. Her eyes were pale and sharp, and when they passed over me, I felt an unpleasant sensation, as though she had catalogued everything about me in a fraction of a second and moved on, finding nothing of particular interest. Security finally arrived, several officers rushing in through side entrances with weapons raised, shouting commands in a dozen languages simultaneously, demanding she identify herself, demanding she surrender, demanding she explain how she had passed through defenses that were supposed to be impenetrable to anyone without the proper authorization codes. She did not run, she did not raise her hands, she simply turned her head slightly toward the nearest officer, an armored Vondrexian nearly twice her size, and said something so quiet I could not make out the words from where I sat. Whatever she said, the officer lowered his weapon immediately, his hands shaking, and took 2 full steps backward, as though she had physically pushed him rather than simply spoken. None of the other officers moved to stop her after that. They stood frozen in place around the chamber's edges, weapons still raised but no fingers on triggers, watching her the way small animals watch a predator they know they cannot outrun. "Who authorized this?" the king finally managed to say, his voice carrying across the chamber, though it lacked its usual commanding certainty. "How did you get in here?" The woman turned to face him fully for the first time, and something about the simple, unhurried movement of her body made the king, a man who had faced down warlords and rebellions across a dozen systems, visibly flinch. "Nobody authorized it," she said. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, carrying easily across the silent chamber despite its softness, and there was something in its tone that made the hair on my neck rise, because it held no anger, no threat, nothing but a quiet, patient certainty that was somehow far more unsettling than rage would ever have been. "I simply walked in. Your doors did not seem to think it was worth stopping me. I imagine that tells you something you should have already known." "You are supposed to be extinct," the king said, and I heard in his voice something I had never heard from him before in all my years attending his sessions. I heard fear, thin and poorly hidden beneath a crumbling wall of authority. The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him the way one might study a curious insect. "Yes," she said. "I read the announcement. It was very moving. I believe several of your worlds held parades." A nervous, disbelieving laugh escaped someone near the front of the chamber, quickly smothered into silence. "My name," the woman continued, before the king could speak again, "is Grace Whitfield. I was a colonel in the Human Defense Fleet, back when there was still a fleet for me to serve in. Some of your soldiers called me by another name, during the war. I understand it has become something of a story among your officers since." Her pale eyes swept once more across the frozen ranks of security personnel along the chamber walls. "I see the story survived rather better than most of the people who told it." Colonel Malhotra, I noticed, had gone very still in her seat, her eyes fixed on Grace Whitfield with an expression that mixed old fear with something else, something that looked almost like recognition, or perhaps relief, that whatever she had suspected for months was finally standing in front of her, undeniable. "You have no right to be here," the king said, finding some measure of his composure at last, drawing himself up on the dais with the practiced authority of a man used to being obeyed. "This chamber is protected under coalition law. Whatever grievance you believe your species holds against us, it ended 4 months ago, when your people chose to end their resistance rather than face the consequences of continuing this war." Grace Whitfield's expression did not change, but something in the quality of the silence that followed the king's words shifted, grew heavier, as though the air itself had tightened in anticipation. "Is that what you believe happened?" she said. "It was not a question that we chose to end our resistance." "We have confirmed reports," the king said. "Your homeworld went silent. Your fleets withdrew from every contested system. Your final engagement at the edge of your territory ended in total collapse. We have the sensor data. We have eyewitness accounts from our own commanders." "You have the sensor data we allowed you to record," Grace said, her voice still calm, still gentle, and somehow that gentleness had become the most frightening thing in the entire chamber. "And you have eyewitness accounts from commanders who saw exactly what we wanted them to see, and reported exactly what they were told to report by people in your own government who understood far more about that final battle than they ever shared with the rest of you. A ripple of confused muttering broke out across the chamber, quickly silenced as the king raised a hand. "That is a serious accusation," he said. "It is a true one," Grace replied. "But I did not walk through your doors today to argue about the past, King Solmara. I walked through them because I think it is time your Senate understood something rather important about the present, and I suspect none of you are going to enjoy learning it nearly as much as you enjoyed celebrating our supposed funeral." She reached into the pocket of her long coat, slow and unhurried, and every weapon in that chamber snapped back up in an instant, 100 officers tensing at once. Grace did not so much as glance at them. She withdrew nothing more threatening than a small, worn data drive, holding it up between two fingers for the entire chamber to see. "I would suggest," she said, "that someone connect this to your main display before I explain to you exactly what your celebration was built on top of." Nobody moved for a long moment. Then, slowly, an aide near the king's dais stepped forward, took the drive from Grace's outstretched hand with visibly trembling fingers, and carried it to the central console at the front of the chamber. The king watched this exchange with an expression I had never seen on his face before in all the years I had served under his rule, an expression that told me, more clearly than any words could have, that some part of him already suspected what was coming and dreaded it completely. I sat forward in my seat, my own heart's pounding, watching as the massive display screen above the king's dais flickered to life, and I understood, with a cold certainty that settled deep into my bones, that whatever we were about to see was going to change everything I thought I understood about the war we had all believed was finally, mercifully over. Grace Whitfield stood perfectly still in the center aisle, waiting, patient as stone, while 1,000 delegates held their breath around her. "4 months ago," she said quietly, into the waiting silence, "you told the galaxy that humanity was extinct. I am here to tell you what actually happened, and I promise you, King Solmara, you are not going to like hearing it nearly as much as you liked telling it." Quashakos. The screen finished loading, and the chamber, already silent, somehow grew quieter still. The footage that filled the screen above the king's dais showed a starfield I did not recognize at first, quiet and ordinary, until a small fleet of human vessels drifted into view, moving in slow, deliberate formation away from what I assumed must be the edge of their territory. There was no chaos in the image, no fire, no wreckage tumbling through the void, just ships, dozens of them, moving with the calm precision of a parade rather than the desperate scattering of a defeated force. "This is recorded footage from the final battle," Grace said, her voice carrying easily over the stunned murmurs spreading through the chamber. "The one your reports describe as our total collapse. I would like you to look closely at what you are actually seeing." The camera angle shifted, and I realized the footage was being shown from multiple perspectives at once, stitched together seamlessly. In one frame, coalition warships advanced on what should have been a crumbling human defense line. In another frame, taken from somewhere far behind that line, human support crews calmly loaded the wounded onto transport vessels, their movements unhurried, methodical, nothing like the panicked evacuation described in the official record I had read months earlier. "Your own commanders reported that we were overwhelmed," Grace continued, "that our defenses collapsed under the weight of your assault. I would like someone in this chamber to explain to me how an overwhelmed, collapsing force manages to evacuate every wounded soldier, every piece of critical equipment, and every civilian still living along that border, without losing a single vessel in the process." Nobody answered her. The king's face, visible in the corner of my vision as I watched the screen, had gone rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the footage with an expression that told me he was seeing something he had genuinely never seen before. "We did not lose that battle," Grace said. "We ended it. There is a difference, and it is a difference your intelligence officers understood perfectly well, because several of them helped us stage it." The chamber erupted into noise at that, delegates shouting questions over one another, demanding explanation, demanding proof, demanding that the king silence this woman and her impossible claims. Grace waited through the noise without any visible impatience, standing perfectly still in the center aisle until the king finally raised both hands and the chamber slowly, reluctantly, quieted again. "That is an extraordinary accusation," the king said, his voice tighter now, less certain than it had been even a few minutes earlier. "You are suggesting coalition officers conspired with an enemy fleet to falsify the outcome of a war." "I am not suggesting it," Grace said. "I am telling you it happened, and I have the names of the officers who arranged it, along with the payments they received, the communications they exchanged with our command structure, and the falsified reports they filed with your Senate afterward." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost none of its calm, gentle quality, though the words themselves landed like small explosions across the chamber. "Admiral Terrence Blackwood, who commanded your joint fleet at that engagement, has spent the last 4 months believing he won a great victory. He did not win anything. He was told exactly where to position his ships, exactly when to advance, and exactly what to report afterward, by a man in your own intelligence division named Edmund Caro, who has been in contact with my people for considerably longer than any of you would find comfortable." A soft, disbelieving gasp rippled through the section of the chamber, reserved for intelligence and military liaisons. I glanced toward Colonel Malhotra again, and found her staring at Grace, with an expression that was no longer merely fear. It was something closer to grim, exhausted vindication, the look of someone who has spent months insisting a wound was still open, only to finally be believed. "Why?" the king said slowly, each word deliberate, careful, as though he were afraid of the answer even as he asked the question. "Would your people go to such lengths to convince us you were extinct?" Grace turned to look at him directly, and for the first time since she had entered the chamber, something shifted in her expression, something that might have been the ghost of old grief passing behind her pale eyes before it was tucked away again beneath that same unshakable calm. "Because we were losing," she said simply. "Not the battles, the war itself, slowly, in ways your sensors could never measure. Every year of open conflict cost us people we could not replace, resources we could not rebuild, time we did not have to prepare for what was coming after this war ended, because wars like this one never really end, King Solmara. They only pause, until someone decides it is time to begin again. We could not survive another decade of open conflict, so we stopped fighting the war you expected us to fight, and we began fighting the only war we could actually win." "What war is that?" the king asked, though from the tightness in his voice, I suspected he already feared the answer. "The quiet one," Grace said, "the one where the entire galaxy believes you are gone, and stops watching what you do next." The silence that followed those words was unlike anything I had experienced in all my years attending sessions in that chamber. It was not the shocked silence of an unexpected announcement, nor the fearful silence of an emerging threat. It was the silence of 1,000 delegates suddenly understanding, all at once, that everything they had celebrated 4 months earlier had been a carefully constructed illusion, built by people patient enough and disciplined enough to fool an entire galaxy for as long as it took to accomplish whatever it was they had actually been doing during those quiet months. "What have you been doing?" I found myself asking aloud, though I had not intended to speak at all. My voice, unused to addressing the chamber directly, carried further than I expected, and Grace Whitfield turned her pale eyes toward me for the first time. "An interesting question, Ambassador," she said, and I felt a chill at the fact that she somehow already knew who I was, though I had never met her before in my life. Rebuilding, reorganizing, learning from every mistake that cost us so dearly during the years you all remember as the war, watching, carefully, which of you celebrated our extinction, and which of you quietly began wondering, the way you did, whether the story you had been told was actually true. I felt every eye in that section of the chamber turn toward me, and I understood, with a strange mixture of pride and dread, that my months of careful, quiet investigation had not gone entirely unnoticed by the very people I had been investigating. "You've been watching us," Colonel Malhotra said, rising slowly from her seat, her voice carrying a rawness that told me the months of suspicion she had carried alone had finally found somewhere to land. "This whole time—" "Of course we have," Grace said, and for the first time something like genuine warmth entered her voice as she looked at the colonel. "You never stopped asking the right questions, Priya. Even when everyone around you decided it was easier to celebrate than to think." That did not go unnoticed either. The king had gone very quiet on his dais, his hands gripping the edges of his podium so tightly his knuckles had turned pale beneath his skin. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost the commanding, celebratory tone it carried 4 months earlier. It sounded instead like the voice of a man realizing, far too late, that he had built his greatest triumph on a foundation that had never actually existed. "What do you want?" he asked. "Why are you here, if not to demand some kind of retribution for what you claim my officers did?" Grace considered the question for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice carried none of the anger I might have expected, none of the triumph either. It carried only that same patient, unshakable calm that had unsettled me from the very first moment she walked through those impossible doors. "I am not here for retribution, King Solmara," she said. "I am here because it is time this Senate understood exactly what it is dealing with, before it makes another mistake as large as the one it made 4 months ago. You built a celebration on a lie your own people helped construct, and you allowed that lie to shape every decision your government has made since, because it was easier to believe your greatest enemy was gone than to consider what it might mean if they were simply waiting." "Waiting for what?" the king asked, and though he tried to keep the fear from his voice, I heard it clearly this time, unmistakable. Grace Whitfield looked around the chamber one final time, taking in the 1,000 frozen faces staring back at her, before her gaze settled once more on the king, calm and unblinking. "That," she said quietly, "is what I came here to explain, and I think you should all sit very still and listen very carefully, because I do not intend to say any of this twice." Grace Whitfield walked slowly toward the center of the chamber floor, her footsteps the only sound in a hall that had, until moments before, held 1,000 voices. She stopped directly beneath the king's dais, looking up at him not with anger, but with the patient, measuring look of someone who has waited a very long time to have this exact conversation. "During the years you remember as the war," she said, "we made a mistake that nearly destroyed us. We fought openly. We let you see our fleets, our strategies, our losses, our grief. We gave you everything you needed to understand exactly how to hurt us, and you used that knowledge well. I do not say that with bitterness, King Solmara. I say it because it is true, and because it taught us something we should have understood far sooner than we did." She paused, letting her gaze travel slowly across the chamber, resting for a moment on each section in turn. The trade delegates, the military liaisons, the young pages who had been dancing in the corridors on the night of the celebration, now watching from a balcony above with wide, frightened eyes. "When we stopped fighting the war you expected," she continued, "we did not stop existing, we simply stopped being visible. Our homeworld did not fall silent because it was destroyed. It fell silent because we chose to make it appear that way, while we moved everything that mattered somewhere your sensors could not follow. Our fleets did not collapse. They dispersed, quietly, into places your coalition has never thought to look, because you believed there was no one left worth looking for." "And what have you built there?" the king asked, his voice tight with something between anger and fear. "In all this time you spent hiding from us." "We did not hide," Grace said, and for the first time, a faint edge entered her voice, sharp enough to make several delegates near the front of the chamber flinch. "We waited. There is a difference, King Solmara, and I would ask you to remember it, because the distinction matters more than you currently understand. Hiding is what a defeated people does. Waiting is what a patient people does, when they have finally learned that patience is a weapon your enemies rarely expect you to use against them." She reached into her coat once more, and though the security officers along the walls tensed at the movement, none of them raised their weapons this time. She withdrew nothing more than a small, folded piece of paper, old-fashioned and plain, and held it up for the chamber to see. "During these 4 months," she said, "we have rebuilt shipyards your scouts never found, because we built them in places your fleet doctrine considers uninhabitable. We have restored our population numbers to levels your intelligence estimates believed impossible, because your estimates were built on the assumption that we would keep making the same mistakes that nearly destroyed us during the war. We have repaired every alliance your propaganda convinced other species to abandon, quietly, one conversation at a time, in places your Senate has no eyes or ears at all." She lowered the paper slightly. "And we have done all of this while your government celebrated our extinction in the streets of 100 worlds, confident that the greatest threat you had ever faced was finally, permanently gone." The chamber remained utterly silent, 1,000 delegates listening to words that were slowly, inevitably, reshaping everything they had believed to be true about the state of the galaxy they governed. "Why tell us this now?" the king asked quietly. "If you have truly rebuilt everything you claim, if you have truly gained the advantage you describe, why walk into this chamber and warn us of it, rather than simply using it against us while our guard remains lowered?" For the first time since she had entered the chamber, Grace Whitfield allowed something that might have been the faint shadow of a smile to touch the corner of her mouth, though there was no warmth in it at all. "Because I am not here to start another war, King Solmara," she said. "I am here to prevent one. There are people within my own leadership who believe the wisest course now would be silence, patience, and eventually, when the moment was right, a reckoning your coalition would never see coming until it was already finished. I am not one of those people, not because I lack the will for it, but because I have seen what a war like that costs, on both sides, and I have no interest in paying that price again unless there is truly no other choice left to us." "Then what do you want from us?" the king asked, and I heard in his voice, for the first time since I had known him, something close to genuine humility. "I want you to understand," Grace said, "that the story you told your people 4 months ago was false, and that the officers who helped build that false story did so for reasons that had nothing to do with peace, and everything to do with protecting positions and reputations they were afraid the truth would destroy. I want you to find those officers, Admiral Blackwood and Edmund Caro among them, and I want you to hold them accountable, not because my people demand vengeance, but because a Senate that cannot be honest with itself about its own failures is a Senate that will make the same mistake again, with consequences far worse than a premature celebration." She let the folded paper fall gently onto the floor of the chamber, and I watched an aide hurry forward to retrieve it, his hands shaking as he unfolded it, and scanned its contents before passing it wordlessly up to the king. "That is a list," Grace said, "of every name, every account, every falsified record connected to the deception that ended our war on paper, though not in truth. I trust your investigators will find it thorough." The king stared down at the paper for a long moment, his face pale, before he finally looked back up at the woman standing calmly beneath his dais. "And if we refuse to act on this," he said slowly, "if we choose, as some in this chamber surely will urge, to dismiss your claims as the delusions of a defeated enemy, grasping for relevance she no longer holds." Grace considered the question with the same patient calm she had carried since the moment she first walked through those impossible doors. "Then you will have learned nothing," she said, "and I will have wasted a conversation I did not particularly wish to have in the first place. But I do not think you will refuse, King Solmara, because somewhere in this chamber, watching all of this unfold, there are people who have spent months quietly noticing the same silences I have just confirmed for you, and I do not believe they will let this matter rest quietly, even if you wished them to." Her pale eyes moved briefly toward me, and toward Colonel Malhotra beside her seat, before returning to the king with the same unshaken calm. "We are not extinct, King Solmara," she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent chamber. "We never were. We are simply no longer the desperate, visible people your fleets fought a decade ago. We have learned to be patient. We have learned to watch. And I would ask this Senate to remember, when it next considers celebrating a victory it has not actually earned, that the quietest enemy is very rarely the weakest one. It is very often the one who has simply learned, at great cost, exactly how much can be accomplished, while everyone else assumes there is nothing left to fear. She turned then, without waiting for any further response from the king or the frozen ranks of security officers along the chamber walls, and began walking back the way she had come, her pace as calm and unhurried as it had been when she first arrived. Nobody moved to stop her. Nobody, I think, truly believed anyone could have. She paused once, just before reaching the great doors at the rear of the chamber, and turned back to look at the assembled Senate one final time. "I will leave you with one more thing to consider," she said. "You spent 4 months believing you had finally won a war that never truly ended. I would ask you to spend the next 4 considering what it might mean, for all of you, that the people you believed you had erased from the galaxy chose to walk calmly through your most secure doors, unarmed, simply to have a conversation, rather than to demonstrate everything else we have learned how to do in the years since you stopped watching us." With that, she turned and walked through the great doors, which closed behind her with the same soft, unremarkable sound they had made when they first opened, as though the entire building itself had simply decided, once again, that there was nothing worth stopping. For a long time after she was gone, nobody in that chamber spoke. I sat perfectly still in my seat, watching the king stare down at the folded paper in his trembling hands, watching Colonel Malhotra finally release a long, shaking breath she seemed to have been holding for 4 entire months, watching 1,000 delegates slowly begin to understand that the galaxy they had celebrated as finally, permanently safe had never stopped being exactly as dangerous as it always was. I thought, in that silence, of the fireworks that had lit the sky above the Capitol on the night of the king's announcement, of the bells that had rung in cities across 100 worlds, of the relief so many of us had felt, myself included, believing that our greatest fear had finally been laid to rest. We had not survived humanity's extinction that night. I understood now, sitting in that silent chamber with the weight of everything Grace Whitfield had said settling slowly over me like a shroud. We had survived something far more unsettling than that. We had survived 4 months of humanity's patience, watching us from the shadows we had assumed were empty, learning everything about us that we had once believed we understood about them. And as the doors of that chamber remained closed, sealed once more against a threat none of us had truly understood until that very moment, I found myself wondering, with a chill that has never quite left me since, exactly how much more patience they still had left to spend, and what it would mean for all of us, the day they finally decided they had waited long enough.